My name's Elisabeth Hendrickson. Let's talk about speed. More specifically, speed of software project delivery. It's kind of amazing. Nobody ever says, hey, I want to figure out how to go slower and be more methodical and cautious. No, everyone I talk to typically wants to figure out how to go faster. This was true when I was a consultant, and it's been true in most of the jobs that I've held. So everyone wants to go faster, and yet our intuition is a terrible source of ideas for how to go faster. The most common ways that I hear is got to hold somebody's feet to the fire, fairly violent. Got to set deadlines because that's the way to create a sense of urgency. And in my experience, these techniques, they tend to backfire. They don't go quite the way people expect. In fact, let's start with a story. So this story takes place a few years ago in an open office plan, back when we had those before COVID. And I want you to imagine, it's me and one of my peers, the head of product management. The two of us are in I'll call it tense discussion. For our purposes, I'm going to call him Jay. That's not his real name, but he needs a name in this story. So Jay has been pressuring me for a while, not just on this particular day, about how to get the engineers to go faster. He's frustrated with the pace of delivery. He has, after all, made commitments to our customers, and engineering is not holding up their end of the bargain. For the moment, I'm going to skip the fact that he made these commitments without actually consulting engineering, but that's neither here nor there. So Jay and I are having a tense but still very professional discussion. Neither one of us is raising our voices, neither one of us is losing it, but we're clearly on opposite sides in a very critical issue. At this point in the conversation, Jay kind of snaps. Jay says, "Oh, come on, Elisabeth. You know developers. You have to light a fire under them to get anything done." This does not go over well with me. In fact, you can probably imagine what's going through my head. At this point, what I'm thinking is, what? No, I don't know that. I don't know that you have to light a fire under developers. The developers that I know all care deeply about delivering value. Nobody is malingering or being lazy. You don't need to light a fire under them. In fact, what I do know is that we have too many top priorities in flight. We have too much work in progress. Nothing is getting done, all the way done, because we are attempting to do too much. Furthermore, your assumptions, Jay, about the duration that something should take are based largely on what you're hearing from your product managers. I'm hearing from those same product managers. One of them cornered me to inform me that the particular chunk of work that was taking a couple of weeks was, in fact, the work of only a couple of days if we had competent developers, and that I should be firing anybody who couldn't deliver said work in a couple of days. That conversation, incidentally, also did not go well. But my point inside my head, because again, I'm not saying this out loud to Jay, that would have been counterproductive, but inside my head, what I'm thinking is, you're making assumptions about how long it should take to deliver based on estimates that somebody who is not the developer gave you, and the only people with valid estimates are the ones who are actually doing the work. Finally, I think that we're probably confusing output and outcomes. You're focused on output and hurrying up the speed of delivery instead of being focused on the outcomes that we actually want. And we are at risk of confusing speed and progress. You're trying to manage by deadlines. And the irony is that deadlines can ultimately make projects go slower. You see, this particular group was working on software that had been around for a while. And there had been, over the course of the years, many people like Jay who had tried to manage by deadline. And as a result, there had been numerous circumstances where the developers had to make a trade-off because something had to give. Sometimes the trade-off they made was against their own personal lives, and they worked a lot of hours. And the thing is about working a lot of hours, exhausted developers don't produce good work. And so the code was incredibly complex, difficult to reason about. And then the other thing that happens is when something has to give, inevitably it often is in the code quality or in the tests. And so there were numerous places in the code where logic had been shoved in wherever it was expedient instead of where it actually belonged. And of course, there had never been time to go clean things up and refactor to make the code easier to work with. Furthermore, writing good automated tests does take time. And so we had a set of tests, but they weren't necessarily the right tests, and they didn't run consistently, and they had tended to have flakes, tests that would fail for no good reason, causing our CI to go red, but we couldn't trust our CI. And this was a natural outcome of having managed to deadlines, and now Jay was turning up the heat even harder on those deadlines, and the engineers were in the impossible situation of having to figure out what trade-offs they could make. But frankly, we were pretty much out of trade-offs that we could make. One of the most insidious things about this is that when a developer has to make a trade-off because of a deadline, what they're really trading off is future risk against current velocity. And that risk, it's nearly invisible. So people like Jay, who had put pressure on the development organization previously, probably didn't stick around long enough to discover the implications of the decisions that the developers had made on their behalf. And we found ourselves in a legacy code situation, and it was pretty difficult to dig out of it. Well, I had to figure out how to frame a response to Jay. So in my head, what I was thinking about was everything that I know that did work. And that's what I really wanted to talk about today. What does work? I want to tell you a story. This is a good story. It's a happy story. It's a story of a project that was tremendously successful, that delivered business value, where the engineering team was incredibly effective. And we worked incredibly collaboratively with our product manager, who was also the company founder. Once upon a time, back in 2007 or so, Drew McManus and Melissa Deardahl had formed a company called Bringlight, and they engaged Pivotal Labs to build the website. Bringlight was a charitable giving app. This was long before GoFundMe was a thing. You can see from the UI, it's a very 2007-ish website. This is a screenshot of the original Bringlight website. This website, it was a charitable giving website, which meant that it was financially critical. It had to take payments, and it needed to stay up so that we could take payments, and it had a wealth of capabilities. A 503c could register themselves, and after going through a vetting process, could start setting up projects. Projects were the unit of funding. So, for example, in this particular screenshot, we see that the Humane Society of Silicon Valley had a project around raising funds that would save animals. There were all sorts of projects across all types of charities. Donors could not just donate to given projects and search for projects that matched their values and charitable giving goals, but donors could also organize themselves into giving groups, and then giving groups could challenge each other, challenge the giving group to raise a certain amount of money cumulatively. So as you see, there were a fair number of features. Now, the team that delivered this was 4 engineers and 1 product manager, Drew. So there were just 5 of us, and we delivered it in 4 months. Furthermore, after the go-live date, there really wasn't a whole lot more that needed to happen to realize the vision of what Bringlight was supposed to be. And ultimately, Drew ended up hiring a part-time developer for a few hours a month to do routine maintenance on the site. So we went live with virtually no bugs, certainly none that were serious bugs. The maintenance cost was comparatively low, and eventually Drew and Melissa sold Bringlight. So overall, I would say that this project was a phenomenal success, and we delivered quite quickly, as well as delivering with quality. At no time did Drew ever set deadlines. At no time did we feel pressured to cut corners. So, how did this work? Why was this such a success and so unusual for most software projects? Before I answer that, let's take a look at some typical sources of friction on any given software project. So, from the time that someone has an idea to the time that it's realized, delivered out in the real world, we'd like to believe that's a straight shot, a straight path forward, and it never is. These paths typically have twists and turns and speed bumps, which is what this illustration shows. And what are typical sources of speed bumps? Well, one is consistently slow feedback. Another is when you have to wait on someone else, when maybe there's another engineering group that is responsible for maintaining the API that you have to rely on, and that group needs to add the endpoint for that API before you are able to do your work and deliver the new capability in the website. Or maybe that other group is an ops group, and you have to file a ticket and wait for your VM to be provisioned before you can stand up your staging site. Whatever it is, oftentimes software development projects involve waiting. And then once the waiting is over, there's a whole bunch of manual work to do, whether it's manual verification or manual deployment or mostly automated deployments except for those few little tiny things, or mostly automated everything except you have to go SSH around nodes in order to collect logs when something goes wrong. But whatever it is, manual work is often a source of friction. And then, of course, after all of this, surprise, there's bugs. Because of course there are, and you end up having to go back around and go through the entire cycle, run through all those speed bumps again in order to deliver the fixes for the bugs. Excruciating. We didn't have any of that on Bringlight. None of it. We were a self-contained team with all the skills that we needed and full access to our staging environment and our production environment, full control of it. We did not have to file a ticket to get somebody else to go do a thing before we could proceed. We were all dedicated, specifically 100% to that project. Well, except for Drew, but we'll get to that in a minute. Because remember, he was a founder of the company, and so he did have other things to do besides work the backlog with the engineers. But the engineers were all 100% dedicated, no multitasking, and we were all deeply engaged in the work. Now, Drew, like I said, he was a special case, and so he split his time between being in the office with us and making sure that we were all aligned on what we were building, and then going out into the wilds of Silicon Valley and trying to raise funds for his startup. We were working with a single flow of work. As is common with many Agile projects, Drew, as the product manager, had the steering wheel. He got to say what we built and in what order. And as engineers, we got to say how we were going to build it and how long it took. And it was a genuine partnership. There was none of this tension between the groups and negotiation. As soon as you start negotiating estimates, you've got a serious problem. Instead, we would give an estimate, and then if Drew didn't like the estimate because it was more than he had mentally budgeted in terms of time for a given capability, we would have a conversation about, well, if this is going to cost this much, what could we do for half the time? And again, it never felt like a tense negotiation. It always felt like partnering around, we know that we only have so many hours total. Let's figure out how to make the best possible use of them with the highest leverage from a business perspective. And Drew was the one who could tell us about the business perspective. Drew worked really hard to keep us all aligned and in being so available to the engineers and so incredibly open to answering questions. He helped us calibrate what was and was not important to him, and consequently we got really good at figuring out what kinds of bugs we should be looking for as we were developing and ensure that they didn't happen versus what kinds of things he would eventually say he just didn't care about. We would frequently go to him and say, hey Drew, we noticed that when we do blah in this site, we get this result. Is that something you care about? And Drew would say something like, oh, holy snacks, yes, please just fix that. Or he would say, no, I don't care about that. Just move on. And over time, we got much better at guessing what his response would be to a given thing. Along the way, we were always working in small shippable units. This was a Rails app, and that did give us an advantage. It was relatively straightforward for us to deliver a capability that was all the way ready for production with nothing left to do. So we had a shared definition of done, and we worked to done, and we worked on small capabilities. A typical thing would take us somewhere between half a day and 2 or 3 days to deliver. And we had fast feedback because as we were working on those small shippable units, as developers, we were doing test-driven development. That meant that we were writing a little tiny executable unit test before we wrote the code that would make that pass. And then, of course, we were doing the full cycle, red, green, clean, make the test, watch it fail, write the code that makes it pass, and then clean up the code base to make it more malleable for the next little cycle of TDD. Furthermore, Drew was amazing at giving us fast feedback. Drew, even when he was out of the office, he would, if he had an hour between meetings as he was trying to get VC funding, he would go sit in a Starbucks and hover over the project tracking software we were using, just waiting for us to deliver a feature, a new thing, so that he could try it out and accept or reject the work. And we knew as engineers that he was hovering and waiting, and that there was a high probability if we delivered something he liked that he would be demoing it when he had a demo, half an hour from that point. That is where I learned about momentum. Drew really is the one who, by example, taught me how important momentum is. We knew that minutes mattered to Drew. We never felt rushed. We never compromised our integrity with respect to engineering practices. We knew that we were in a partnership and that what we needed to deliver solid, high-quality code that would not have, risk of not being able to accept payments, for example. But at the same time, we also knew that Drew was waiting and eagerly, never punitively, always eagerly waiting for the next thing. And so the way this played out was there were several times where we were just inches away from being able to deliver something. And if we hadn't had that sense of momentum and that sense of Drew cares and wants to see this so that he could maybe demo it, we might have said, as lunchtime approached, yeah, we'll get back to this after lunch. And instead, what we said was, if we take 5 more minutes now, I think we could deliver this. Do you want to just take the 5 minutes and deliver this? And as a result, Drew got things sooner and we got feedback sooner, and it became this virtuous cycle. We were eager to get the feedback, so we were eager to deliver. And again, I can't emphasize enough the extent to which this was a sense of momentum and not a sense of pressure. And consequently, we never cut corners. But we did make sure that we used every hour of every day as effectively as we possibly could have. So that is how this project Bringlight worked. Now, that all sounds great, right? Don't you want to live in that world? Sounds fabulous. But it's counterintuitive to so many people who would say, but what about the efficiencies? It is a common thing to say, well, if we want to go faster, we should make the most efficient use possible of every single developer. And that means that we want to ensure that the utilization of every developer is as close to 100% as possible, and that they are leaning into their specialties where they're going to have a much higher point of leverage. And so we're going to create a system that's really focused around efficiency of use of developer time. It's a trap, incidentally. And Elihu Goldratt talks about that trap in The Goal beautifully. But it's something that our brains tell us sometimes. It seems intuitive that if we wanted to be efficient, we should make the most efficient use of somebody's time. As by contrast, the way that we worked on Bring Light, we were focused on throughput through the entire system. So we weren't always operating in the most efficient way possible, but the end result was quite effective. Now, I also want to take a quick pause to talk about yak shaving and the importance of learning how to shave the right yaks. Because the other thing about efficiency that some people sometimes think is, it will be more efficient if while I am in this piece of code, I just go ahead and do all this other work that I know needs to happen anyway. Or it will be more efficient if we hold off on delivering so that we can just batch everything all together. And the end result of that will be less overhead. That will be more efficient. And part of what I learned on that project was the importance of shaving the right yak. Now, that phrase, that probably seems a little bit weird to some of you. Anyway, it is a common phrase used in the software engineering field and elsewhere. It came out of the MIT lab, and Seth Godin has a lovely blog post describing his story of the yak story. I have my own, so I'm going to tell that very briefly. It's a lovely Saturday afternoon, and you decide that it's a perfect time to go trim your hedges. So you go into the garage to get the hedge trimmers, and that's when you realize, oh yeah, they're not there. I lent them to the neighbor. I better go get them. So you're about to go over to your neighbor's house to get your hedge trimmers, and that's when you remember, oh yeah, the reason I haven't asked for them back yet is that I still have their lawn furniture from the time that we did a socially distanced small family gathering, but needed enough seats outside for everybody. So you head back into the garage to get the lawn furniture so that you can return it. And that's when you discover that the dog got to the cushions on the lawn furniture and they have all been ripped to shreds. So you're about to go into the house to get the sewing kit so that you can restuff the things, the cushions, and sew them back up so that you can return the lawn furniture, so that you can get your hedge trimmers, so that you can trim your hedges because it's the perfect day for it. And that's when you remember your neighbor was bragging about how they had special ordered this from a catalog that specialized in fair trade yak stuffing, stuffed furniture. And so you realize that you can't just restuff it with whatever polyfill you happen to have on hand. And so that's how you find yourself with trimmers and a bag packed in a suitcase heading to the airport, hoping that despite COVID, you'll be able to catch a flight to the Himalayas where you can shave a yak, stuff the bag, bring it back, stuff the furniture, sew it back up, return it to the neighbor, get your hedge clippers so that some number of weeks later, you would be able to trim your hedges. Now, Seth Godin, in describing the yak shaving problem, says don't shave the yak. Go to Lowe's and get a new pair of hedge trimmers. I have a different take. My take is the difference between a more senior engineer and a more junior engineer is the senior engineer has learned which yaks to shave. So it's not that we never did the, hey, while we're here, let's do this thing while we were on Bring Light. There were times that we did. But it was always in service of the work that we were doing at the time. We were hyper-focused on delivering the capability that we were actually working on. And when we chose to shave yaks, they were always the yaks that would do our near-term future selves a favor. We weren't trying to future-proof for 2 years from that point, but we knew that if we were going to have to go back and do this in the next, couple of days anyway, and it would help things go faster now, it was the right digression. It was the right yak to shave. Ultimately, everything that we did on that project was all about eliminating friction, those speed bumps that get in the way. And this wasn't the only kind of friction that I learned about at labs. Eliminating friction involves identifying every source of an interrupt between idea and implementation. And the things that I just talked about on Bring Light were really at a project level. But this happens at a micro level every single day. And I will admit that there are times when I get accustomed to certain speed bumps or sources of friction and just start ignoring them. I think it's a common thing. In one particular case, I was working on a different project, not Bring Light, much long before that, in the early 2000s, probably 2004 or so. And I was pairing with Alex Chafee, and Alex taught me something so critical in that moment. So I was relatively new to pairing. We were pairing on my personal laptop, and he was helping me get something set up. My personal laptop was, let's call it, quirky. It had a tendency to, the mouse was a touch pad mouse, and the mouse had a tendency to move wherever it felt like on the screen. So you'd be working along and things were going fine, and then all of a sudden the mouse cursor would teleport to someplace else on the screen, and you'd have to patiently get the mouse back where it was supposed to go. Now, as it was, Alex was exhibiting a fair amount of patience with me and my mousing, because he's the kind of person who memorizes keyboard shortcuts in order to, again, eliminate that friction between the time he has an idea of how to express something in code and the actual writing of the code. So mousing does get in the way a bit on that. However, he was willing to put up with that. But the first time he noticed that my mouse decided to teleport to some other part of the screen, he just looked at me and he said, can I get you an external mouse? We have external mice. An external mouse would be good right now. And I being relatively inured to the pain of the mouse moving around, said, no, I'm fine. Again, I was relatively new to pairing and was not picking up on the cues that my pair was giving me, but we're going to gloss over that for the purposes of this story as well. Now, at this point, Alex's knee started doing this. You can picture it, right? Somebody whose knee is bounce, 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 bounce. And then the mouse thing happened again, and Alex's knee sped up a little bit, and Alex turned to me and he said, we have external mice. Would you like an external mouse? External mice are good. And I said, no, it's fine. This won't take very long. It'll take you longer to go get the mouse. Let's just keep going. And we kept going. And then all of a sudden, so Alex's knee is doing this, and Alex suddenly shouted, 3! I looked around. What? To him, he wasn't explaining, so I just kept doing what I was doing. Alex's knee, and then he says 4, and that's when I realized he was counting the number of times that my quirky mouse had interrupted our flow. And at that point I said, okay, fine, go get an external mouse. And Alex was right. In that moment, he taught me the value of seconds and the cost of ignoring the sources of friction. It took less time to go get an external mouse and plug it in and get it working. Even though that felt like a big interruption, it took less time to do that than it would have taken to recover each time the mouse got in the way. So it's an example of shaving the right yak, and Alex taught me something very important about workflow as a developer. Ultimately, it's about increasing momentum. At every step in the way, as we eliminate friction, we increase the possibility of momentum, and developing software goes from feeling like you're driving a truck through sand to feeling like you're skating across a wonderful ice. All right, so you may recall we started this story with me standing with Jay in an open plan office having a tense discussion. What happened? He had just said, come on, Elisabeth, you know developers, you have to light a fire under them to get anything done. And I needed to frame a response. I took a very deep breath and I calmly said, Jay, the pressure you're putting on the team is going to backfire. We will end up going slower. Let's work on establishing momentum instead of increasing the pressure. Now, I really wish that I could tell you that in that moment, Jay had an epiphany and realized that I was right and that we should work on momentum and supportive culture that would help engineers do their best work. That is not exactly what happened. Jay and I really struggled to get along. He continued to put pressure on me. Honestly, I don't remember what happened with the particular deadline that he was concerned about. And in the grand scheme of things, that one particular deadline didn't really matter. Eventually, Jay decided that he wanted to go work on other things in the organization and not have to deal with me and this particular engineering team. And so he moved on and presumably put the same kind of pressure on whatever group he moved on to. But what happened to our group? Well, you may recall we were shipping enterprise software. It was fairly complex. It was enterprise software that had been around for a while and had a number of circumstances where shortcuts had been made. And we were slogging through the increased risk that had resulted from all of those shortcuts over time. And this was ultimately why Jay was so frustrated with the pace of development. Over the course of the next 2 years, because there are no quick fixes and it does take time to address the underlying issues, the underlying sources of friction. But over the course of the next 2 years, we managed to organize ourselves so that we were able to enable teams to focus. Now, one of the differences between a fairly small scope Rails web app and a, honkin' big piece of enterprise software is that it's not the kind of thing you can develop with 4 people in 4 months. So we did have multiple teams, and the teams had to coordinate, and so we didn't end up with a fully self-contained team, but we were able to structure ourselves to enable teams to focus. We changed our branching strategy. Historically, teams had worked in massive batch sizes, so instead of the ideal of small incremental delivery, teams historically had incredibly long-running branches that were more than even feature branches, and there had been circumstances where we had lost huge amounts of work. Huge amounts of work had ended up going to waste because, for whatever reason, the branch was never going to be able to be merged back together with other branches that were all being developed in long-running projects. So we reduced the amount of work on any given branch and changed our branching strategy. We paid down a lot of technical debt. We invested heavily in test automation, in automating manual tasks, and invested in our CI. And ultimately, I'm so proud of the team. We went from struggling to ship on an annual basis to being able to ship incredibly predictably monthly. At which point we could have trade-off discussions that weren't about how are we going to make this deadline, and were more about there's going to be a bus leaving every month. What do we want to have be on it? So ultimately, these are the stories and the lessons that I have learned around how to speed up a team. It's really hard to do this. It's incredibly valuable. Honestly, I think attempting to manage by the pressure of deadlines is an easy way out that honestly doesn't work all that well. But doing these things, this is how you speed up a team and get a sense of momentum. Thank you very much. I hope you have a fantastic conference. I'm so glad that I have been able to be here.